Local productions seen on Delta College Public Media are made possible with support from viewers like you. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Mike Redford, and this is the follow-up. Coming up on tonight's show, as the fighting rages on in Israel, the impact is being hit hard here at home. The executive director of the Flint Jewish Federation is here to share his heartfelt reaction and tell us how you can help those who are hurting and in harm's way. Plus, one of our regular guests here on the follow-up has written a book about renowned author George Orwell. No doubt you have heard of the books Animal Farm in 1984. Well, there is much more to Orwell than you ever imagined. But first, we have viewer reaction to last week's show here on the follow-up. We talked about the financial fallout from the UAW strike, a strike that in recent days appears to be close to ending, thankfully, with the UAW reaching tentative agreements with the big three automakers. This viewer call to our follow-up hotline, a next-year worker in Saginaw, reminds us not to forget about them.
Hi, Mike. My name is Steve. I'm watching your show here. Strike issue with the UAW, and this affects the people that work for GM, Ford, or Stellantis. Now, I work at Nextyear in Saginaw. I mean, we've got a UAW local, but this isn't doing anything for us. We're not lumped in with them. Other bigger places get so many more benefits than we do, and it's like we're the redheaded stepchild. People, look at UAW as a blanket thing. Well, it's not. Clients like ours, I don't think they get the same representation, really, and I'm looking at that from the international, helping us out. And our local people do the best job they can. And I almost hate to be lumped in with some of these guys because they're the high dollar people and we're not. So just my comments. I just want to make it and enjoy the show. Thank you. Bye.
Well, thanks for the call, Steve. Much appreciated. And we'd like to hear from more of you to help drive the conversation here on the program. You can do that in a variety of ways via social media on Facebook, or you can dial into our follow-up hotline, as that viewer just did, to voice your opinion or suggest future show topics. You can also leave comments on YouTube, and if you'd like to watch any of our past shows, just log on to deltacollegepublicmedia.org. Now for tonight's show, we have a special guest in the studio, Stephen Lowe. He is the executive director of the Flint Jewish Federation. Thanks for coming in. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
So it's really hard to put into words what's going on in Gaza. With the battle and the bloodshed only escalating. So as a leader within the Jewish community of Flint, what message can you kind of share with our viewers on behalf of the community you represent in terms of sort of what's happening over there and how they're being impacted?
Well, I mean, there's the full gamut of emotion. First of all, shock that it came upon us suddenly. Ironically, we were in the midst of our Daniel Pearl Memorial World Humanity and Harmony Festival when I got the news. And so, of course, first there's shock, then there's sorrow,
right.
And I'm sorry about all the victims, sure. About the people caught in the crossfire. Right. There's a great deal of anger, of course, as you would expect, confusion. The Jewish community is a diverse one with a lot of opinions, so it's been tough.
And you have family and friends over there. I know from a family standpoint, your daughter-in-law is Israeli. I think
yes.
You said she's in New York.
Yes.
Your daughter is in the IDF.
Yes.
She's a dual citizen, so how might it affect them?
Well, of course, she's in the reserves. She did her duty a number of years ago, but she voluntarily serves in the reserves. And she was planning to go over and do her reserve duty when it all happened. She's been in contact with her unit. She'll have to decide, they'll have to call her and she'll have to decide if she's going to go. And of course, I'm sure she's scared and I'm scared.
Absolutely. On the heels of all this, last year there was a statistic that said anti-Semitism was up like 24%. That was last year. Now you have what's happening over there now. There's been a rise in anti-Semitism, as you know, all across the country, including here locally. Anti-Israel protests are growing, some of which are happening on college campuses. Our young kids are involved in this. So what are your thoughts as you see it, and what, if anything, can we do to combat it?
look, from what I've heard in the last 3 weeks, anti-Semitic incidents, and that's just the reported ones, is up 400%. And we know that Jews are, in this country, 7 million at most, probably 6 million out of a population of 332 million. So we feel very isolated. Many people are scared, especially with what's going on college campuses. One of the most important things you can do is stand up to it. Until recent years, these people didn't feel emboldened to come out, but now they do feel emboldened, and you cannot simply sit idly by when you hear something anti-Semitic or witness it, or Islamophobic, for that matter. You must stand up and confront it.
Right. I know in the Flint community, the Jewish community, you've got, I think, 3 congregations. I know in recent weeks, because of all that's happening, the anti-Semitic things, you've had to increase security, right? Is there a sense of fear amongst the folks you represent?
Among some, yes, absolutely. For this music festival, I had to contact the sheriff's department. I had to put on additional security from the Flint Institute of Music. And who would think that to go and pray and to pray for peace, you have to have an armed guard at the door? We routinely have to have that at our places of worship. It's terrible.
Right.
Terrible.
That's something you have to do in this day and age. It's hard to believe we have to go to that extreme. Bloodshed and war is not new to that region, as you know. Long history of fighting between the Israelis and the Palestinians, not to mention this extremist group, Hamas. We'll get into that in a moment. But in your opinion, can you help us sort of better understand what makes this sort of current conflict different, maybe, than what we've seen in recent years?
First of all, the absolute sheer brutality of the attacks. We've never seen anything like this. With the torture, the mutilation, the beheading of babies, it's brutal. Right. That's number one. And number two, the sense that the Israelis, who we thought were very, well, I don't want to say invincible, were caught by surprise.
Right.
And the fact that this time there's a resolve to do what it takes to see that you just don't leave a festering, going on.
Right, and we're showing some numbers on the screen of the casualties and the dead as a result, but we'll continue to talk. So on that note, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, he equated the latest conflict with how the U.S. reacted to the attack on Pearl Harbor, the attack on 9/11, that Israel has to strike back hard, pushing farther into Gaza to sort of wipe out Hamas once and for all, which is kind of what you're saying. They've got to keep going, right?
Absolutely, but I think what you're seeing now is a very methodical, measured response. There wasn't an immediate response. It wasn't, yes, there's been a lot of bombs dropped, absolutely, but in terms of going into Gaza, it's been slow and steady with an attempt to absolutely minimize civilian casualties.
Right. And to be clear, it's not the innocent Palestinian people that you have an issue with. It's really this extremist group, Hamas, who's launched these latest attacks on October 7th.
I would be willing to bet that the vast majority of Palestinians just want to live their lives, raise their kids, have them go to school, be educated, get good jobs. There is a terrorist group like Islamic Jihad who's in their founding principles says our goal is to destroy Israel and kill all the Jews. That's what they're focused on. That's their first and foremost goal.
Right. You have to wonder what the future of Gaza, what it might look like when this is all said and done. It won't be the same place. Will it be occupied by Israel? I mean, how will that change, do you think?
What really has to happen in an ideal situation is that, in an ideal situation, there would be no more civilian casualties. Hamas would be banished or pushed out or killed. A neutral party would come in to oversee new elections. The new elected authority would say, they would refute Hamas's thing and say, we want to live in peace, we recognize Israel's right to exist, and then they would get down to the business of really governing. Mm-hmm. That would happen. I can't imagine that Israel wants to go in there.
Right.
You know, they left in 2005. They turned it over to Hamas. They evacuated 9,000 people, some of them against their will. So there's nothing to be gained from Israel going in and taking over.
Sure. So let's segue into the humanitarian crisis that we're seeing. Mm-hmm. So many people displaced, so many people killed, injured. They can't get food, they can't get water, they don't have electricity. So as executive director of the Flint Jewish Federation, tell us about sort of what you guys are doing here at home to get that message out and help those that are in harm's way over there.
Well, I'm part of a network of federations, and we actually do, you know, humanitarian work in 70 countries around the world. But with regards to Israel, there's a special campaign. Some people, of course, are making arrangements to bring people home with private transportation, or to get people over there who have to get over there. Some people are taking materiel, food, clothing, medicine, water. Most of us have to do something else, and the easiest, most direct way is to give money. I'm very proud of the Flint community. We have raised $35,000, and for a small community, that is something. But I know that, you know, worldwide, probably at least 60, 70, 80 million has been raised.
So for our viewers that are watching, how can they get involved? How can they say, listen, I want to help? Do they go to your website? Do they talk to people? What are some things you'd advocate for?
Certainly, you can go to our website. You can call our office. The simplest thing you can do is you can express support. Express support to Jewish people. If you have friends in Israel or whatever, make the call, send the email, send the text. Mm-hmm. Number two is if you see some anti-Semitic behavior going on, Islamophobic behavior going on, confront it, shut it down. You need to contact your legislators, right, and let them know that you support Israel and that they need to support Israel. Yeah. And then, you know, lastly, there are places that are collecting goods and getting them shipped over, or if you want to make a financial contribution, it is all needed. People have been displaced, they've lost their homes, their clothing, their books, there's relocation expenses, there's funeral expenses, there's therapy expenses for people who are traumatized. Mm-hmm.
Do you sense you might see some refugees landing in our front porch here in the coming months?
I think it's very possible. Mm-hmm. There are Israelis who are stranded here now and who need a place to go. Mm-hmm. I'm sure there are also probably Palestinians who are stranded here and need a place to go. Right. So, if we can support them, we should.
And I should say that prior to this crisis, the Jewish community in Flint was doing a lot to support the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. And now we've got this double whammy, right? So you're still supporting...
Absolutely. We're still supporting Ukraine. You know what? We also supported Hawaii. Mm-hmm. We also gave support for wildfires and floods. And it should be very clear to your viewers, we're not just sending funds to assist the Jewish community.
Right.
We provide sustenance and help to people regardless of race, creed, sexual orientation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
All right. And we have that on our screen, flintfed.com, the Flint Jewish Federation. Stephen Lowe, the Executive Director of Flint Jewish Federation, thank you so much for coming in. You're going to stick around because I'm going to record the after-show segment with you, which our folks will be able to see on our web as well, because we have a lot more to discuss. So thanks for coming in.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
You bet. On that note, you can walk off, and I'm going to bring on another special guest. He is a regular here on the follow-up. Peter Brian Barry with the Saginaw Valley State University philosophy professor. And typically, Peter, we talk about world events and other things that are happening, but tonight we're going to talk about this. This is a book that you authored, the George Orwell, The Ethics of Equality. And we're going to have a graphic of the book on the screen, and there it is right there.
Looks good.
So let's talk about this book. It's been in the works for a while. How long did it take to write it? Why'd you write it? What's the inspiration?
So the project got started, I believe, in about 2018. A fellow academic who I'd never met sort of reached out. He was putting together a volume titled The Cambridge Companion to George Orwell's 1984. And based on some other stuff that I'd written, he asked if I wanted to contribute a chapter. It was very specific. It was it's something kind of niche, but it was really, really interesting. And so for the first time in my life, I started doing Orwell scholarship. Okay. I thought this might be a one-off thing. I hadn't expected to turn into a career. But I found so much of interest just in this one in just this one particular project. And, had written a couple books before, was always trying to figure out what the idea is for the next book. And one afternoon, I sort of had an idea, started to think how the pieces would fit together, and here we are.
So your interest in Orwell doesn't go way back. You don't recall maybe reading 1984 or Animal Farm back in high school and college like many of us were assigned when we
Vaguely.
took literature class? Okay.
Yeah, I'll be honest. I know I did not read it in college, but going back through Animal Farm and 1984 in particular, there was so much that was familiar. Must have read the thing in high school, but I'll be honest. I remember a lot less than I'd care to admit. So, like a lot of us, was part of my academic career as a young man, made an influence as a young man. But if I told you that I was a lifelong Orwell reader, that would be a lie. This is something I've sort of really gotten interested in and developed an affection for kind of later in life.
Right, and to be clear, this is not biographical Orwell. So there are some biographical books about Orwell, but this isn't about that. This is a different twist, right?
Yeah, there's no shortage of biography and scholarship. In 1950, Orwell passed away. So we are quickly coming up on the 75th anniversary of his passing. You will have all the Orwell scholarship and biography that you could possibly want. And there's great works out there. This book is really working at the intersection of philosophy and Orwell's own literature. There's kind of a popular interpretation of Orwell among his biographers, that Orwell was really hostile to philosophy, that he was uncomfortable with it, perhaps even that he was hostile to it. But as someone who does this for a living, when I read Orwell, I see philosophical concepts everywhere, not just insofar as he's discussing justice and some other kind of ethical themes, but actually hinting at some pretty powerful arguments and engaging in the philosophical concepts in a way that I don't think has been appreciated. So hopefully this book will help with that appreciation.
So going into this project, did you have some preconceived notions about Orwell in terms of philosophy? And then once you dug sort of deep into it, it kind of changed your mind a little bit, that there was more to it or less to it, or what came out of that journey, I guess?
Yeah, I guess the big one, and this is something that I do get into in the book, Orwell has this reputation of having this sort of mythical capacity for honesty and truth-telling. And when you look both at his biography, but also what he had to say about, say, the ethics of journalism, it's a little bit more complicated than that. So Orwell, for example, worked for 2 years at the BBC, writing propaganda for the war effort in a division that was dubbed the Liars' School.
Okay.
And so there's this fascinating correspondence between Orwell and some of his people where he kind of acknowledges that he's not telling the truth, but he thinks he's got justifications for it. So there's these popular conceptions of Orwell that he himself kind of refutes, and is worth our attention for all kinds of reasons that are relevant today.
So those that aren't familiar with Orwell, I mean, you mentioned a little bit about him. Can you give us like the Cliff Notes version of who Orwell was? And he did more than just 1984 and Animal Farm. He did a lot of stuff, right?
So those are his last two books.
Yeah.
He had legions of essays, book reviews, what we might call lesser novels, reportage. His Homage to Catalonia is one of the best works written about the Civil War. He was actually an Englishman who joined up with the anti-fascist Spanish resistance. He was shot fighting the Spanish fascists prior to his return in England. He was targeted by Soviet sympathizers and communists. He himself was both sort of a revolutionary, but he also identified as a democratic socialist, even as he was very critical of Soviet-style totalitarianism. He was born in Burma. He worked for the British Raj, developed a great guilt that animated the rest of his work throughout his life. He's a fascinating figure. There's all kinds of contradictions and polar opposites that make for an incredibly rich life, in addition to him being a tremendous and important writer.
Sure. So when I think about the books that I was assigned, I think in high school, I think you and I talked about a little bit. I think I read Alamo Farm in high school. I think I was assigned 1984 in college when I took a literature class. He's been gone for a while. Those books have been out for a while. So some viewers may say, so what now? What makes his works kind of still relevant today? What can I learn from that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot that's probably still relevant. Orwell, for example, introduced the phrase Cold War.
Really?
We're still kind of at maybe a new stage of the Cold War, a development of the Cold War, but our relationship with then the Soviet Union, now Russia, is still something that probably bears fruit if we sort of go back and reread Orwell's criticisms and his concerns and you know, the various approaches that he recommended. I think there's something else that's really important about Orwell, though, and sometimes when you ask people why should we read Orwell today, the thought is, well, you know, he anticipated all this technology and surveillance and all that stuff. I think the real important thing about Orwell is that he really understood the need to sort of, when you're trying to convince someone politically, to not come at them as an adversary. One of the reasons that Orwell, well, again, he identified as a socialist, but he was deeply critical of his contemporary socialists because he thought they were speaking a language that common-day people just did not understand and were going to alienate typical working-class persons. One of the things that Orwell really strove to do was to try to meet people politically where they're at. That if we're going to be sympathetic, if we're going to be fighting for the same cause, then you have to appeal to people in terms of the values and commitments that they already share. If you give them a really complicated history in Marxist dialectical materialism, that's going to fall on deaf ears for people. It's just the wrong place to start. If you're critical of people who have not, say, established class mentality, I'm talking like a socialist now, that's probably not going to be fruitful. But Orwell recommended instead coming at people in using language like justice and brotherhood. He recommended rallying his fellow Englishmen by appeal to their patriotism and native decency, values that he thought his fellow Englishmen would share in the pursuit of a common cause. There's a lot to be said for present-day activists to take a look at Orwell and think about how you're talking to people who are, say, potential allies, but maybe don't share your theoretical commitments or don't share your history of education or your values. There's got to be some convergence of values, some convergence, some agreement that you can work with. Start there and work your way outwards. Orwell anticipated moral psychology that some of my colleagues are studying and doing research on today. I mean, it's there when you look at his correspondence in the 30s and 40s. And again, his criticism of some fellow travelers. Orwell's real lesson to us, I think, is how to engage with one another politically. We can do so in a way that's critical, but also in a way that engages other people where they're at.
So who's your target audience? Who do you think, who should pick this book up and read it? What are the kinds of, you know, I enjoyed it. I didn't read it all.
Yeah.
But I'm still working my way through it. So who do you envision? Who's going to pick it up? Who do you?
So,
would there be people that said, "I've read Animal Farm 1984. I'm going to read it"?
Yep.
Okay.
I think that's a great place to start.
Right.
The more you know about Orwell, even if you don't know everything, the more you've read about Orwell, even if you haven't read anything. There's plenty there for you. I'm a professional philosopher, but my student population, say at SVSU, is not philosophy majors. We don't have philosophy majors because we don't have a philosophy major. My goal is to try to teach and write about philosophy in a way that the intelligent but uninformed person would understand and get something out of. So if you've got an interest in Orwell, if you've got an interest in learning more about ethics and political philosophy, this is really a book that I think you can learn a lot from, but especially for the crowd that has any interest or sympathy in Orwell at all. Sometimes I disagree with Orwell, and sometimes I criticize him, but I guarantee you're going to understand his thought better than you did before.
So as a philosophy professor, even though we don't have philosophy majors per se, will you ever assign this book to your students at SVSU?
I regularly teach a class titled Philosophy and Literature. There's a version of this class in the works. I have not taught it yet, but I'm really hoping to spend a whole semester talking about ethics and George Orwell. It'd make for a great time for me.
So tell us a little about the process in putting a book like this together. Who did you bounce it off of? Is it colleagues? Is it others? Just try to bounce some things. Tell us a little about the process.
All of the above. Reached out to some other fellow philosophy professors and kind of gave them a half-baked idea, got some feedback, started thinking about the chapters and what the content of the book would look like. Eventually, you write up a prospectus, and you just start throwing it at people. I got very lucky. I had applied for and got a grant from the American Philosophical Association and the British Academy. So I got to go to London for a while and do some research. And I'm pretty sure that one of the folks on one of those committees is also editing a series for Oxford University Press. He thought well enough of the prospectus that he sort of suggested, hey, why don't you pitch the book to Oxford? Got a contract out of there. Short answer, you show it to as many people as you can. The more feedback, the better.
So at the end of it, do you feel good about it? Are you very critical of yourself? Could I have done it differently? I mean, at the end of the day, you're looking back and go, you know what? I think it's pretty good. How did you feel about it yourself?
I think it's pretty good. I'll be honest, a little bit of critical distance comes with time. So ask me in a couple months. But I'm really proud of the book. I think it's one of the better things that I've done. I've gotten good feedback so far, and I really hope it gets more people reading Orwell and reading philosophy.
And you had written some things before this, not Orwell. What else had you written for people?
The first two books were about the subject of evil, of all things. One just sort of about the very concept of evil. The other one is philosophy, literature, and evil, which is, I suspect, how I got involved in this stuff in the first place. Evil was one of Orwell's most commonly used words. It was one of his most famously used words. Some of his literary executor made a point of noting just how often he used it, but had frustratingly little to say it by way of the definition. This is what got me interested in as a philosopher.
Right.
What's the concept that he's using, and how might we use it fruitfully?
So I got it on Amazon. This is your pitch in a few seconds. How do folks find it, get it, go to Amazon? What would you recommend?
Any of the major platforms. You can go to Oxford University Press and order it directly from them. You can go to Amazon. You can order it from your favorite bookstore. Oxford University Press is a great publishing outlet, and anybody should be able to get their hands on it.
Excellent. And I have a signed copy, so thank you very much.
Absolutely.
I encourage you to read it. It's a good one. Thanks, Pete.
Thanks, Mike.
And that's our show for tonight, but be sure to join us again next week for the follow-up. What are some of the biggest health challenges facing you and your neighbors? 2 county health officers will join us next week to weigh in right here on the follow-up. In the meantime, hit me up on social media or dial into our follow-up hotline. We would really like to hear from you. Thanks for joining us tonight. Have a great night.